A 10-year-old boy in rural Tennessee claimed he found a statue of the Virgin Mary glowing in the forest and carried it back to town. The whole community laughed at his childish imagination, until the statue began performing miracles that left everyone speechless. The October morning mist clung to the Tennessee hills like a prayer whispered in the dawn. 10-year-old Timothy Mitchell had always loved these early hours when the world seemed caught between sleeping and waking, when the ancient oaks and maples of the Appalachian foothills looked like they were holding secrets. Timmy, as everyone in Millfield called him, wasn't supposed to be wandering the woods alone at 6 a.m. on a Saturday. His mother, Sarah Mitchell, had strict rules about staying close to their small farm on the outskirts of town. But something had pulled him from his bed that morning, a feeling he couldn't name, like someone calling his name from very far away. Millfield, Tennessee, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where 3 generations of families sat in the same church pews every Sunday, and where a boy walking alone through the forest at dawn would be the talk of the town by noon. The community of 800 souls was predominantly Baptist, with Grace Baptist Church serving as both spiritual center and social hub for most residents. The Mitchell family had attended Grace Baptist for as long as anyone could remember. Timmy's grandfather had been a deacon, his father Robert worked as a mechanic and sang in the church choir, and his mother Sarah taught Sunday school for the younger children. Timmy himself was known as a quiet, thoughtful boy who asked more questions about Bible stories than most adults were comfortable answering. "That child's got an old soul," his grandmother used to say before she passed the previous winter. "He sees things other folks don't see." This morning, Timmy felt that old soul pulling him deeper into the forest than he'd ever ventured before. Past the familiar creek where he caught tadpoles, beyond the clearing where his father sometimes hunted deer, into a part of the woods that seemed untouched by human presence. The trees grew thicker here, their canopy so dense that the morning light filtered through in cathedral-like beams. Timmy found himself walking more slowly, not from fatigue but from a growing sense that he was approaching something sacred. It was in a small grove, surrounded by ancient white oaks, that he saw her. At first, Timmy thought it was just a trick of the light, the way the morning sun was hitting a pale tree trunk or a limestone outcropping. But as he drew closer, his 10-year-old heart began to race with recognition and wonder. It was a statue about 3 feet tall, carved from what appeared to be white marble or alabaster. The figure depicted a woman in flowing robes, her hands clasped in prayer, her face tilted slightly upward with an expression of serene compassion. Most remarkably, the entire statue seemed to emit a soft, warm light, not reflected sunlight, but something that appeared to come from within the stone itself. Timmy had seen plenty of religious statues in his short life. Grace Baptist Church didn't have any. Baptists generally considered such things too Catholic. But he'd seen them in books and during a family trip to Nashville the previous year. This was different from anything he'd ever encountered. "Mary," he whispered, though he wasn't sure how he knew. The name seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory or Sunday school lessons. As he approached the statue, Timmy noticed that the ground around it was covered with wildflowers that shouldn't have been blooming in October. Delicate white blossoms that seemed to mirror the gentle glow emanating from the carved figure. The boy knelt down in front of the statue, not because anyone had taught him to, but because it felt like the natural thing to do. Up close, he could see intricate details in the carving, the delicate folds of the robes, the compassionate expression in the stone eyes, the way the hands were positioned as if offering a blessing. "Are you really Mary?" Timmy asked aloud, feeling only slightly silly for talking to a statue. "Jesus's mother?" The forest seemed to hold its breath. No wind stirred the leaves, no birds called from the branches. In that profound silence, Timmy felt something he would spend the rest of his life trying to explain, a presence that was unmistakably maternal, protective, and filled with love. Without fully understanding why, Timmy reached out and touched the statue's carved face. The stone was warm under his small fingers, warmer than it should have been in the cool October morning. "You're lost, aren't you?" he said with the matter-of-fact directness that only children possess. "You shouldn't be out here, all alone. People need to know about you." What happened next would be debated in Millfield for years to come. According to Timmy, and he never wavered in his account, not even when adults questioned him with increasing skepticism, the statue's carved lips seemed to move ever so slightly, as if whispering words meant only for him. The message was simple: "Take me home, little one. Take me to your people." Without hesitation, Timmy wrapped his arms around the statue and lifted. He expected it to be impossibly heavy. It was, after all, carved from stone and nearly as tall as he was. Instead, it felt no heavier than his baby sister when he carried her around the house. The walk back to town took almost an hour, but Timmy never grew tired. The statue seemed to grow lighter with each step, and the mysterious glow that surrounded it made the forest path ahead clearly visible despite the thick canopy above. It was just after 8 a.m. when Timmy Mitchell walked down Main Street, carrying what appeared to be a 3-foot marble statue that glowed with its own inner light. The first person to see him was Mrs. Betty Henderson, who was sweeping the front porch of Henderson's General Store. "Timothy Mitchell," she called out, her voice sharp with concern and confusion. "What on earth are you doing? Where did you get that thing?" Word spread through Millfield with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. By 8:30, a crowd of curious residents had gathered around Timmy in the town square, all talking at once. "Boy, where did you find that statue? Timothy, does your mother know you're out here? What's that light coming from it? Is that supposed to be some kind of saint or something?" Timmy tried to explain about the forest grove, about the feeling that had drawn him there, about the voice that had asked him to bring the statue to his people. But with each word, the adults' expressions grew more skeptical. "Honey," said Mrs. Patterson, the town librarian, "statues don't talk. And they certainly don't glow. You've got quite an imagination." "It's just the way the morning light is hitting it," added Mr. Crawford, who ran the hardware store. "Makes it look like it's glowing, but it's just reflected sunlight." Even as the adults offered rational explanations, several of them had to admit, quietly, to themselves, that they couldn't quite account for the warm light that seemed to emanate from the statue, or the way the carved face appeared almost alive in its serene beauty. The crowd was still debating what to do when Pastor William Hayes arrived. Pastor Hayes was a good man in his 50s who had led Grace Baptist Church for over 20 years. He was known for his practical approach to faith and his gentle but firm opposition to what he considered Catholic superstitions. "What's all the commotion about?" Pastor Hayes asked, pushing through the crowd. When he saw Timmy holding the statue, his expression hardened. "Timothy," he said, his voice kind but firm, "where did you get this statue?" Once again, Timmy told his story, the early morning call to the forest, finding the glowing statue in the grove, the voice that asked him to bring it to his people. Pastor Hayes listened patiently, but his face grew increasingly troubled. "Son," Pastor Hayes said when Timmy finished, "I think you've let your imagination run away with you. This is just an old statue, probably left behind by campers or dumped in the woods by someone cleaning out an attic. There's nothing miraculous about it." "But Pastor Hayes," Timmy protested, "it was glowing, and it spoke to me. It said to bring it to our people." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some people were charmed by the boy's obvious sincerity, while others worried that he was being influenced by Catholic nonsense, or, worse, that he was deliberately making up stories for attention. "Timothy," Pastor Hayes continued, "I know you're a good boy with a vivid imagination, but statues don't speak. They don't glow. And they certainly aren't vehicles for divine communication. This kind of thinking is exactly what leads people into idol worship and superstition. He gently but firmly took the statue from Timmy's arms. The moment it left the boy's hands, several people in the crowd gasped. The warm glow that had surrounded the statue flickered and dimmed, though it didn't disappear entirely. "I'll take this to the church for now," Pastor Hayes announced. "We'll figure out the proper way to dispose of it later. Timothy, you need to go home to your parents. I'm sure they're worried sick about you." Timmy's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't argue with the pastor. He'd been raised to respect authority, especially religious authority. But as he walked away from the crowd, he kept looking back at the statue in Pastor Hayes's arms, and his 10-year-old heart was heavy with the certainty that the adults were making a terrible mistake. By noon, the story had reached every household in Millfield. The reactions were predictably mixed. Some people were concerned about Timmy's mental state. Was the boy having some kind of breakdown following his grandmother's death? Others worried about Catholic influence somehow infiltrating their Protestant community. A few wondered if the child had actually experienced something supernatural, though they kept such thoughts to themselves. Robert and Sarah Mitchell were mortified. They'd spent the morning frantically searching for their son, only to learn that he'd been parading through town with a religious statue, claiming it spoke to him and glowed with divine light. "Timothy Allen Mitchell," his mother said when he walked through the front door, her voice carrying the particular tone that meant serious trouble. "What were you thinking? Wandering off into the woods alone, worrying us half to death, and then filling people's heads with these wild stories?" "But Mom," Timmy said, tears still threatening, "it really happened. She really talked to me. She asked me to bring her to our people." "She?" his father interjected. "Timothy, it's a statue. An inanimate object. It doesn't have a gender, and it certainly doesn't talk." Robert Mitchell was a practical man who fixed engines for a living. He believed in God, attended church faithfully, and raised his family according to biblical principles. But he had no patience for what he saw as emotional excess or supernatural nonsense. "I think you've been reading too many fantasy books," he continued. "Or maybe watching too much television. Real faith doesn't involve talking statues and magical lights. It involves reading the Bible, attending church, and living according to God's commandments." Timmy spent the rest of that Saturday in his room, grounded for wandering off and causing a disturbance. But even as he sat on his bed, staring out the window toward the forest, he couldn't shake the memory of that warm, maternal presence he'd felt in the grove, or the gentle voice that had asked him to bring the statue home. That evening, Pastor Hayes called an emergency meeting of the church deacons. 6 men gathered in the church basement to discuss what they saw as a potential crisis in their community. "Gentlemen," Pastor Hayes began, "we have a situation that requires careful handling. Young Timothy Mitchell has somehow gotten hold of a Catholic statue, appears to be the Virgin Mary, and he's telling everyone it spoke to him and glowed with divine light." Deacon Miller, who owned the largest farm in the area, shook his head grimly. "We've got to nip this in the bud, Pastor. Can't have our children thinking that Catholic idol worship is acceptable." "The boy's probably just confused," added Deacon Thompson. "Lost his grandmother recently, didn't he? Sometimes children act out when they're grieving." "It's not just acting out," said Deacon Crawford. "Half the town saw that statue this morning, and I'll tell you what, there was something unusual about it. Can't quite put my finger on what, but—" "Jim," Pastor Hayes interrupted, "surely you're not suggesting there was actually something supernatural about a piece of carved stone?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Crawford replied carefully. "Just saying that several folks mentioned an unusual luminance about the thing." Pastor Hayes sighed. "Gentlemen, we cannot allow superstition and Catholic mysticism to take root in our community. I propose we dispose of the statue properly, and counsel young Timothy about the dangers of letting imagination interfere with genuine faith. The deacons voted unanimously to support Pastor Hayes's plan. The statue would be removed from church property first thing Monday morning, and the Mitchell family would be counseled about keeping their son's imagination in check. What none of them could have predicted was what would happen on Sunday morning. Grace Baptist Church was packed for the 10 a.m. service. Word of Timothy's adventure had spread beyond Millfield, and several families from neighboring communities had come to see the statue for themselves. Pastor Hayes had reluctantly agreed to display it at the front of the church during the service, partly to satisfy curiosity and partly to demonstrate that it was just an ordinary piece of carved stone. The statue sat on a small table to the left of the pulpit, looking serene and beautiful in the morning light streaming through the church's plain glass windows. To most of the congregation, it appeared to be exactly what Pastor Hayes claimed, an old Catholic statue of no particular significance. But Timmy, sitting in the third pew with his parents, could see what the adults either couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. The statue was glowing, softly, but unmistakably, and every few minutes, he could swear he saw the carved lips move slightly, as if the figure was praying silently for the assembled congregation. Pastor Hayes's sermon that morning was titled, Faith versus Superstition, and he used Timothy's experience as an object lesson about the dangers of confusing imagination with genuine spiritual experience. "My friends," he said, gesturing toward the statue, "this is nothing more than carved stone. It was created by human hands for the purpose of Catholic worship, which we know to be based on unbiblical practices. Young Timothy is a good boy with a vivid imagination, but we must not allow ourselves to be led astray by childish fantasies." It was during the closing prayer that everything changed. Pastor Hayes had just asked the congregation to bow their heads when 8-year-old Emma Carson, who had been born with a severe hearing impairment, suddenly stood up in the back pew. "I can hear," she cried out, her voice clear and strong. "I can hear everything." The congregation's heads snapped up in shock. Emma Carson had been profoundly deaf since birth, able to communicate only through sign language and lip reading. Her parents, Mark and Linda Carson, stared at their daughter in disbelief. "Emma," her mother whispered, "can you really hear me?" "Yes, Mama," Emma said, tears streaming down her face. "I can hear your voice. I can hear everything." The church erupted in gasps and confused murmuring. Mark Carson, a man not given to emotional displays, began to weep openly as he tested his daughter's hearing with whispered words and questions she answered perfectly. But Emma wasn't looking at her parents. She was staring directly at the statue of Mary, which now seemed to glow with an intensity that was impossible to deny or explain away. "The beautiful lady smiled at me," Emma said, her new voice filled with wonder. "She touched my ears and made them work." Pastor Hayes stood frozen behind the pulpit, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. Around him, the congregation buzzed with excitement, confusion, and awe. "It's a miracle," someone whispered. "Praise the Lord," said another voice. "How is this possible?" asked a third. In the third pew, 10-year-old Timothy Mitchell looked up at his parents with an expression that was both vindicated and concerned. His mother's face was pale with shock, while his father stared at the glowing statue with the look of a man whose understanding of the world had just been fundamentally challenged. And at the front of the church, the statue of Our Lady of the Forest continued to emit its mysterious, warm light, as if announcing that the age of miracles was far from over. The silence that followed Emma Carson's miraculous healing lasted exactly 37 seconds. Pastor Hayes would later remember timing it on his watch, as if measuring the moment when his orderly world shifted forever. Then the church exploded into chaos. "Did you see that? Emma can hear. Look at the statue. It's glowing brighter. This can't be happening." Mark Carson was on his knees beside his daughter, whispering her name over and over, watching in amazement as she responded to every sound. Linda Carson had collapsed into the pew, sobbing with joy and shock. Around them, 200 members of Grace Baptist Church were experiencing something none of them had been prepared for. Pastor Hayes gripped the pulpit, his prepared sermon notes scattered and forgotten. Everything he had just said about superstition and imagination seemed to mock him from the pages at his feet. He looked at the statue. There was no denying it now. The carved figure was radiating light that had nothing to do with reflected sunshine or optical illusions. "Everyone, please," he called out, his voice shaking slightly. "Let's maintain order. There's obviously something happening here that we need to understand." But order was the last thing the congregation was interested in. Families were pushing forward to get a closer look at Emma, to see for themselves that the profoundly deaf child could indeed hear perfectly. Others crowded toward the statue, some reaching out tentatively to touch it, others backing away in fear or confusion. It was Mrs. Eleanor Wright, 83 years old and suffering from severe arthritis that had kept her housebound for months, who approached the statue next. She had been helped to church that morning by her grandson, her gnarled hands barely able to grip her walker. "If the Lord is working miracles today," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "then I'm not too proud to ask for one." Before anyone could stop her, Mrs. Wright placed her twisted hands on the base of the statue. The change was immediate and undeniable. Her fingers, which had been locked in painful arthritic claws for years, slowly began to straighten. The swelling in her joints visibly decreased. Within moments, she was flexing her hands normally, tears of gratitude streaming down her weathered face. "Praise God," she whispered, then louder, "Praise God Almighty." The church erupted again. Some people fell to their knees in prayer, others rushed forward hoping for their own healing, and still others backed toward the exits, frightened by events beyond their understanding or theological comfort zone. Young Timothy Mitchell, watching from his family's pew, felt a mixture of vindication and overwhelming responsibility. He had been right. The statue was special, was holy, was somehow a vessel for divine intervention. But he had also unleashed something that his small community was clearly not prepared to handle. Pastor Hayes, meanwhile, was experiencing a crisis of faith and authority that would reshape the rest of his ministry. Everything he had preached about the sufficiency of Scripture, about the end of the miraculous age, about the dangers of Catholic mysticism, was being challenged by events unfolding in his own sanctuary. "Please, everyone," he called out again, "let's not lose our heads. There's obviously something extraordinary happening here, but we need to approach this with prayer and careful consideration." But his congregation was no longer listening to him. They were witnessing the kind of divine intervention that most had only read about in the Bible, and theological concerns about denominational differences seemed suddenly irrelevant. By the time the service officially ended, though it bore no resemblance to the orderly worship Pastor Hayes had planned, word was already spreading throughout Tennessee. Emma Carson's healing had been witnessed by 200 people. Mrs. Wright's arthritic hands had been restored to full function before dozens of witnesses. And the statue continued to glow with an intensity that defied natural explanation. That afternoon, as news spread through Millfield and beyond, the reactions were as varied as the people hearing the story. Some dismissed it as mass hysteria or religious delusion. Others wondered if they were witnessing the beginning of a genuine revival. The local newspaper received dozens of calls, some demanding investigation, others insisting the story be suppressed to avoid embarrassing the community. But for the families directly affected by the morning's miracles, there was no confusion or doubt. Emma Carson spent the afternoon discovering sounds she had never heard: her mother's laughter, birds singing outside her window, her own voice speaking words she had only known through sight and vibration. Mrs. Wright called every relative she could think of, flexing her restored hands as she dialed numbers she hadn't been able to manage in years. And in the Mitchell household, a 10-year-old boy who had been dismissed as imaginative and attention-seeking was suddenly being viewed very differently by his parents. "Timmy," his mother said, sitting on the edge of his bed that evening, "I owe you an apology. We didn't believe you about the statue." "It's okay, Mom," Timmy replied with the easy forgiveness of childhood. "I knew you'd understand once you saw her working." "Her?" his father asked from the doorway. "You keep calling the statue her. Like it's a person." "Because she is a person, Dad. I mean, not exactly a person, but she's Mary, Jesus's mother. And she loves us." Robert Mitchell sat heavily in the chair beside his son's bed. As a man who fixed broken engines, he was accustomed to problems that had logical solutions, causes that produced predictable effects. But what he had witnessed that morning challenged every assumption he had about how the world worked. "Timmy," he said carefully, "what exactly happened in the forest? I want you to tell me everything, exactly as you remember it." For the third time that day, Timmy recounted his early morning journey, the discovery of the glowing statue, and the voice that had asked him to bring it to his people. But this time, his parents listened with the attention and respect his account deserved. "She said our people needed her," Timmy concluded. "I think she meant everyone in Millfield, not just our family." "But son," his mother said gently, "we're Baptists. We've never believed in praying to Mary or asking saints for intercession." "I don't think she cares about that," Timmy replied with startling insight. "I think she just cares about helping people who are hurting." Monday morning brought chaos to Grace Baptist Church. Pastor Hayes arrived to find dozens of cars in the parking lot and a line of people stretching around the building. Word of the miracles had spread throughout Tennessee and into neighboring states. People were coming from hundreds of miles away, hoping to see the statue, to pray for healing, to witness whatever divine intervention was taking place in rural Millfield. Among the crowd were representatives from various media outlets, theologians from multiple denominations, and medical professionals hoping to examine Emma Carson and Mrs. Wright to verify their healings. The small town was completely unprepared for the attention. Pastor Hayes found himself in an impossible position. His denominational superiors were pressuring him to remove the statue and end what they saw as a dangerous drift toward Catholic mysticism. But his own congregation, those who had witnessed the miracles firsthand, were equally insistent that the statue remain. "Pastor," said Deacon Crawford, who had been among the skeptics just 2 days earlier, "I don't understand what's happening any more than you do. But I know what I saw. Emma Carson can hear. Eleanor Wright's hands are perfect. That statue is doing something that can't be explained away." "Jim," Pastor Hayes replied wearily, "I'm not trying to explain anything away. I'm trying to understand how to handle a situation that's completely outside my experience or training." The decision was ultimately taken out of his hands when Dr. Michael Stevens, a respected physician from Nashville, arrived to examine the healing miracles. Dr. Stevens had been Emma Carson's audiologist since birth and had Eleanor Wright's complete medical history dating back 15 years. After thorough examinations of both women, Dr. Stevens held an impromptu press conference in the church parking lot. "I cannot explain what has happened to these two patients," he announced to the assembled crowd. "Emma Carson's hearing is now completely normal, with no trace of the congenital defects that had rendered her profoundly deaf. Eleanor Wright's arthritis has completely disappeared. Her joint mobility is that of a healthy 40-year-old. A reporter from the Nashville newspaper raised her hand. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, is there any medical explanation for these changes?" Dr. Stevens was quiet for a long moment. "In 30 years of practice, I have never seen anything like this. From a strictly medical standpoint, these recoveries are impossible. That evening, Pastor Hayes made a decision that would define the rest of his ministry. Standing before a congregation that now included visitors from across the Southeast, he delivered what many would later call the most important sermon of his career. "My friends," he began, 48 hours ago, I stood in this pulpit and spoke about the dangers of superstition, about confusing imagination with genuine faith. I used a 10-year-old boy's experience as an example of childish fantasy that needed to be corrected." He paused, looking directly at Timothy Mitchell in the third pew. "I was wrong. And I owe that boy, and all of you, an apology." The church was completely silent. "I don't understand what's happening here," Pastor Hayes continued. "I don't understand how a statue can glow with its own light, or how touching it can restore hearing to the deaf and mobility to the arthritic. These events challenge everything I thought I knew about how God works in the world." He gestured toward the statue, which continued to emit its mysterious, warm radiance. "But I know this. God is moving in our community in ways we didn't expect and don't fully comprehend." A child had the faith to recognize something holy when he encountered it, and the courage to bring it to his people despite knowing he might be ridiculed or dismissed. Pastor Hayes looked around the packed sanctuary. Perhaps it's time for us adults to learn from that child's example. Over the following weeks, Millfield became an unlikely pilgrimage destination. The statue was moved to a specially constructed chapel adjacent to Grace Baptist Church, where people could visit for prayer and meditation. More healings were reported, not dramatic, instantaneous miracles like Emma's and Mrs. Wright's, but gradual recoveries, unexplained improvements, and profound spiritual experiences that visitors struggled to put into words. The theological implications were debated in seminaries and church conferences across the country. How could a Baptist church become the site of apparently Marian miracles? What did it mean when Protestant and Catholic pilgrims knelt side by side before the same statue? Was this evidence of God's desire to bridge denominational divisions, or a dangerous drift toward syncretism? For Timothy Mitchell, now acknowledged as the discoverer of what people had begun calling Our Lady of the Forest, life changed dramatically. Reporters wanted to interview him, theologians sought his insights, and pilgrims treated him as a young prophet. But Timmy remained remarkably unchanged by the attention. "I just found her in the woods," he would tell anyone who asked. "She asked me to bring her to our people, so I did. The miracles are her doing, not mine." 1 year after that October morning in the forest, Millfield had been transformed. The small town now had guest houses for pilgrims, a visitor center, and a chapel that welcomed people from dozens of denominations. Pastor Hayes had become an unexpected advocate for what he called faith without denominational boundaries, and his sermons drew visitors from across the theological spectrum. The statue itself remained largely unchanged, still glowing with its mysterious light, still emanating a presence that visitors described as unmistakably maternal and loving. Medical professionals continued to document healings that defied conventional explanation, while theologians debated the implications of apparently Catholic miracles occurring in a Protestant context. But perhaps the most significant change was in the community itself. The divisions between different Protestant denominations had largely dissolved, replaced by a shared recognition that divine love operated beyond human theological categories. When Catholic pilgrims began arriving, they were welcomed alongside Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians who had traveled hundreds of miles to pray before the statue. On the first anniversary of Timothy's discovery, the town held a celebration that drew thousands of visitors. As part of the ceremony, 11-year-old Timmy was asked to speak about his experience. Standing before a crowd that included network television cameras and representatives from the Vatican, the boy who had carried the Forest Virgin home delivered a message that would be quoted in theological discussions for years to come. "I think grown-ups sometimes make faith too complicated," he said, his young voice carrying clearly across the gathered assembly. "Mary didn't ask me what church I went to when she asked me to bring her home. She just asked me to bring her to our people. And I think our people means everyone who needs love and healing and hope." He paused, looking out at the diverse crowd before him. "She's still here because people still need her. And I think she'll stay as long as people remember that love is bigger than the differences we argue about." As Timmy spoke, the statue in the chapel behind him seemed to glow a little brighter, as if approving of the wisdom contained in a child's simple words. Today, Our Lady of the Forest Chapel welcomes over 100,000 visitors annually. The healings continue, though they come now in quieter forms: depression lifting, addictions broken, families reconciled, faith restored. The statue remains in its place of honor, still glowing with the mysterious light that no scientist has been able to explain. Timothy Mitchell, now in his 20s, serves as a chaplain at the chapel, ministering to pilgrims from every conceivable religious background. He never married, feeling called to a life of service to the thousands who continue to seek healing and spiritual comfort at the site of his childhood discovery. And sometimes, in the early morning hours when the mist clings to the Tennessee hills like a whispered prayer, visitors to the chapel report seeing a young boy walking through the forest, as if still carrying something precious home to his people. Because some discoveries change not just individuals, but entire communities. Some children have the faith to recognize the holy when adults see only the ordinary. And some statues carry within them a love so profound that it transcends every human division and calls all God's children home. And there you have it. This incredible story of childhood faith and divine vindication touched your heart, didn't it? Little Timothy proved that sometimes God chooses the smallest voices to carry the biggest messages, and that the Virgin Mary's love transcends all denominational boundaries, right? If you were moved by this real testimony of how a 10-year-old boy found a glowing statue of the Virgin Mary in the Tennessee forest and watched her perform miracles that united an entire community across religious divisions, hit that like button below. It really helps me continue sharing these stories that show how Mary's maternal love reaches beyond any church walls. If you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. Every week there's a new testimony that will renew your faith that the Virgin Mary works through the pure hearts of children and calls all believers to unity in her Son Jesus. And don't forget to check out our store in the first pinned comment. We have amazing Christian products, including the 365-day Devotional, perfect for strengthening your relationship with Jesus and understanding Mary's role as mother to all Christians. Tell us in the comments, have you ever experienced something miraculous that others dismissed? Do you believe the Virgin Mary can work through children in special ways? And if you also believe in Mary's power to unite believers across denominations, write, "Mary unites all." Declare your faith in her universal maternal love. Share this video with parents, with people from different Christian backgrounds, with anyone who needs to remember that God often chooses the humble and innocent to carry his greatest messages. Thanks for watching until the end. May the Virgin Mary bless your life and help you maintain childlike faith in her miraculous love. See you in the next testimony.